Tonight, let me tell you about history's most successful nobody. A man who won an empire for his best friend, and in return was granted the privilege of being slowly erased from the story. This is the tale of Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, the man who did the dirty work. It's a story of how loyalty can be the heaviest chain you'll ever wear, and how being indispensable is just another word for being trapped. To understand the scale of this tragedy, you first have to understand the scale of the man. He was the military genius who defeated Antony and Cleopatra at the legendary Battle of Actium. He was the architect who built the original Pantheon, a marvel that still stands in Rome today. He was the engineer who gave 1 million citizens clean water, constructing aqueducts and public baths on a scale the world had never seen. For a time, he was the second most powerful man on earth, and he spent his life ensuring history would give all the credit to someone else. If you appreciate history with the propaganda peeled off and the ugly truth exposed, consider subscribing and dropping a comment with where you're listening from. I'm curious who else enjoys their history served black, without the sugar coating of traditional tales. So take a slow, deep breath, settle into your cozier spot, let the world outside fade away, as we journey back to the final bloody days of the Roman Republic, where a rich boy with no name made a bargain that would reshape the world. Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa had everything except what mattered in Rome, an ancient name. In the year 63 BCE, in the rolling hills of central Italy where the morning mist clung to olive groves like a secret, a child was born to wealth without glory. The Vipsani estate sprawled across the countryside, its red-tiled roofs catching the first light of dawn, its storehouses bulging with grain, oil and wine. The scent of pressed olives hung perpetually in the air, mixing with the earthy smell of well-tended soil, and the occasional whiff of horse leather from the stables. His family belonged to the equestrian order, which meant they had money, real money, the kind that bought you the best Greek tutors who smelled of papyrus and ink, the finest wool togas that whispered when you walked, and absolutely zero respect from the patrician families who'd been running Rome since Romulus murdered his brother on the Palatine Hill. The equestrian curse was simple and cruel, rich enough to see power, too plebeian to touch it. Young Marcus grew up in a villa where the walls were painted with scenes of ancient victories his family had never won, where the atrium fountain bubbled with water as clear as his understanding of his place in the world. He could buy his way into the best schools in Rome, could afford a house on the Aventine Hill, but he could never buy what the Corneli or the Claudi were born with, the right to rule. It was in Rome's most exclusive school, in a colonnade that smelled of chalk dust and adolescent ambition, that Marcus first met Gaius Octavius. The other boy was everything Marcus wasn't. Delicate where Marcus was strong, pale as moonlight where Marcus was bronzed from outdoor exercise, connected to divinity where Marcus was firmly rooted in provincial soil. But they shared something more valuable than blood or breeding. They shared brilliance. The afternoon sun slanted through the columns when they first truly spoke, casting bars of shadow across the marble floor like a prison grate. The other students had given their flowery answers to their rhetoric teacher's question, full of mythological allusions and tired metaphors. When Octavius spoke, his voice was soft as spring rain, but his words cut like winter wind. He dismantled the question, restructured it, and provided an answer so elegant that their teacher, a pompous man from Athens, actually stammered. After class, Octavius approached Marcus. Up close he smelled of some expensive oil, maybe cedar. His hand, when he offered it, was cold despite the warm afternoon. The pale boy stated with quiet certainty that Marcus understood. It wasn't a question, and Marcus could only agree, his affirmation hanging in the air between them like incense smoke. But alliances in Rome were like morning frost, beautiful, delicate, and quick to melt under pressure. What transformed their friendship into something harder than iron came 2 years later, in the blood-soaked aftermath of civil war. Marcus had an older brother, Lucius. Where Marcus was careful, calculating, always watching the political winds, Lucius burned with the righteous fire of the old Republic. When the war between Caesar and Pompey tore Rome in half like a piece of old parchment, Lucius chose his side without hesitation. He joined Cato, that stubborn defender of ancient virtues, and marched off to Africa to fight against Caesar's tyranny. The news came on a winter morning when ice crystals hung from the fountain in the Vipsanius garden. Lucius had been captured after the disaster at Thapsus. Caesar's men had him in chains, and the punishment for rebels was crucifixion, a slow death under the African sun. Ravens pecking at your eyes while you still breathed. Marcus remembered the moment perfectly. The messenger's boots had left muddy prints on the marble floor. His mother's scream had sent the house slaves scattering like frightened birds. His father sat in his study, staring at nothing, age spots on his hands suddenly more visible in the pale winter light. And Marcus? Marcus did the only thing he could do. He went to his friend. He found Octavius in his uncle's garden on the Palatine, reading Cicero beneath a laurel tree. The great Julius Caesar was away, planning his next campaign. But his nephew had his ear. Marcus spoke without preamble, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. His brother had chosen the wrong side. Octavius looked up from his scroll. Those pale eyes softened with something that might have been genuine sympathy. He corrected gently that Lucius had chosen honour. Never the wrong choice, just sometimes an expensive one. The garden was quiet except for the splash of water from a fountain carved with dolphins and sea nymphs. Marcus couldn't finish the question that burned in his throat. To beg went against every instinct, but the unspoken plea hung between them heavier than any spoken words. Octavius revealed that he had already acted. His uncle had received the letter that morning. Lucius would be pardoned and sent home. Caesar, he explained, valued loyalty, even the loyalty of his enemies' brothers. The relief hit Marcus like a physical blow. His knees actually buckled, and he had to grip the edge of the stone bench to stay upright. In that moment, smelling the laurel leaves and tasting the bitter winter air, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa understood the true price of friendship in Rome. It wasn't gold, it wasn't connections, it was debt, the kind that could never be repaid with coin. 3 months later, on the Ides of March, when 23 daggers found their way into Julius Caesar's body, and the blood of the dictator mixed with the rain on the Senate floor. That bargain would be tested in ways neither young man could have imagined. But that winter morning in the garden, with Lucius's life hanging in the balance and salvation offered as casually as a cup of wine, the chains that would bind Marcus Agrippa for the rest of his days were forged, invisible, unbreakable, eternal. 3 months. That's all the time fate would give them before the debt came due in ways neither could have imagined. 3 months before, the Ides of March changed everything. When word reached Apollonia, where Octavius and Marcus were finishing their education, it came wrapped in confusion and dripping with blood. The messenger arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat that steamed in the cool morning air, foam flecking its mouth like sea foam. The man himself looked no better. His tunic was torn, his face streaked with road dust that had mixed with tears or sweat into muddy rivulets. The messenger gasped out the impossible news. Caesar was dead. The words seemed to suck all the air from the courtyard. Marcus watched his friend receive the news. Octavius went very still, like water before it turns to ice. His pale face, already translucent in the early light, became almost corpse-like. But his eyes burned with something that made Marcus take an involuntary step back. The Greek tutors scattered like leaves before a storm. Within moments, Marcus and Octavius stood alone in the courtyard, the morning sun painting everything the colour of fresh blood. Octavius's voice had changed when he commanded that they leave immediately. The boy who quoted poetry and debated philosophy was gone. In his place stood something harder, colder, more dangerous. Marcus warned that the assassins would have agents on every road. They would know Caesar had named Octavius in his will. He was a threat now, Octavius corrected him. They were both threats now. Then, with unexpected vulnerability, he asked if Marcus would accompany him, warning that the path ahead would be neither clean nor safe nor honourable. The debt hung between them, unspoken but heavy as a legionary's pack. Lucius, saved from crucifixion, a life owed for a life given. They left Apollonia that night, slipping out through a gate Marcus had bribed with his family's gold. 3 times on the road to Brundisium they avoided assassination attempts. The first was clumsy. Brigands who attacked with too much coordination to be random. Marcus killed 2 of them in the darkness, their blood black in the moonlight, while Octavius held the horses. The second attempt was more sophisticated. Poisoned wine at an inn, identified only because Marcus noticed the innkeeper's hands shaking as he poured. The third was the closest. Professional killers who separated them on a mountain pass. It was Octavius who saved them that time, not with a sword but with words, offering the lead assassin so much gold that his own men turned on him. By the time they reached Rome, the boy who had saved Lucius was gone forever. In his place stood Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, heir to a god, claimant to a legacy written in blood, and beside him, as always, stood Marcus Agrippa, learning with every mile that the price of his debt would be paid not in gold, but in other men's lives. The Senate tried to ignore them at first, but Octavian, he insisted on the name now, wearing it like armour, had something they hadn't counted on. He had Caesar's name, yes, but more importantly, he had Marcus Agrippa. While Octavian gave speeches in the forum, his voice carrying over the crowds like honey poured over broken glass, Marcus worked in the shadows. He recruited Caesar's veterans with promises and coin. He identified which senators could be bought, which could be blackmailed, which would need to disappear. He learned that a knife in the dark could change more votes than all the rhetoric in Cicero's arsenal. The year 41 BCE found them masters of Rome alongside Antony and Lepidus. The second triumvirate, they called it, as if giving tyranny a fancy name made it more palatable. The Republic was dead, it just didn't know it yet. And then came Perugia. The city sat on its hill like a boil on the landscape, swollen with rebels who still believed in the old ways. Octavian wanted it gone. Not defeated, not surrendered, but gone. An example that would echo across Italy like a scream in the night. One evening, as they stood on a hill overlooking the besieged city, Octavian posed his question carefully. The cooking fires of 40,000 soldiers spread below them like fallen stars. The air reeked of unwashed men and latrine trenches. Marcus studied the walls where defenders moved like ants, tiny and desperate. He could take the city, he assured his friend carefully, but Octavian clarified that taking the city wasn't what he had asked. What he wanted to know was whether Marcus could do what needed to be done after. The unspoken orders hung in the air like the smell of coming rain. Marcus thought of Lucius, of a pardon granted with casual grace. His affirmation came as a single word: yes. Perugia fell on a morning when frost made the grass crunch beneath the legionaries' boots. The defenders, starved to shadows after months of siege, barely managed to lift their swords. Marcus led the assault himself, first over the walls, his gladius finding gaps in armour with mechanical precision. But taking the city was the easy part. Octavian's orders came with cold precision. 300 senators and knights who had defied them would be executed on the altar of divine Julius. It was the Ides of March, the anniversary. Of course it was. Marcus gave the orders. He stood in the blood-slicked forum and watched as 300 of Rome's elite were butchered like sacrificial bulls. Some begged, some prayed, some stood silent, their eyes accusing even as the blade fell. The altar, white marble that morning, was black with blood by nightfall. When the killing was done, Octavian commanded that everything burn. Marcus watched the city burn from the same hill where they'd planned its destruction. The flames rose high enough to stain the clouds orange, and the screaming carried for miles. Women and children hadn't been formally condemned, but fire makes no such distinctions. Octavian appeared beside him like a ghost. He wondered aloud if the carnage bothered his friend. Marcus admitted that yes, it bothered him. Octavian found this good. It should bother him. But the important thing was that Marcus had done it anyway. That was why he was needed. Because Marcus could do what was necessary even when it burned him from the inside. Marcus observed quietly that someone had to be the monster, so someone else could be the saviour. Octavian smiled then, an expression as cold as winter moonlight. His friend understood perfectly. As Purusha burned through the night, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa stood beside his friend and watched their reflections dance in the smoke-filled air. Two young men, barely into their 20s, painting their path to power with other people's ashes. In the distance, a wolf howled. Or perhaps it was just another victim of the flames. Their last cry distorted by distance and wishful thinking into something more noble than human suffering. The years that followed taught Marcus many lessons, but none more bitter than this. Here's what they don't tell you about being the best general in Rome. You can't actually be the best general in Rome. That honour has to go to the man paying your salary, even if he vomits at the sight of blood. Marcus learned this lesson in the salt-stained ruins of Sicily, where the Mediterranean's azure waters had turned red with Roman blood. Twice, Sextus Pompey, son of the great Pompey Magnus, had transformed himself from refugee to pirate king, his fleet commanding the seas that fed Rome. Every grain ship that tried to reach the capital paid his tax or fed his sharks. The people were starving, and someone had to do something about it. That someone was supposed to be Octavian. The first battle had been a disaster so complete that poets would have written epics about it, if anyone had survived to tell the tale. Octavian's fleet, expensive, shiny, and utterly unprepared for real naval warfare, had been shattered like pottery against Sextus's experienced marines. The young triumvir himself had barely escaped, clinging to wreckage while his purple cloak dissolved in the brine. Marcus found him on the beach at Rhegium, retching seawater and what remained of his dignity onto the sand. Without words, because what words could matter in such a moment? Marcus helped his friend to his feet. Octavian's response was a look that contained multitudes, shame, fury, and underneath it all the absolute certainty that Marcus would fix this. Because Marcus always fixed things. The solution came to Marcus in the pre-dawn hours as he walked among the wreckage of their fleet. Traditional Roman naval tactics were useless against Sextus's hit-and-run style. They needed something new. The harpax was born from necessity and desperation. Part grappling hook, part catapult. It could fire iron claws connected to winches that would drag enemy vessels close regardless of wind or oar. Marcus spent months perfecting it, working with blacksmiths who thought him mad, and shipwrights who knew better than to say so. He rebuilt the fleet from the keels up, training crews until their hands bled from the ropes. Every dawn found him on the practice waters. Every dusk saw him adjusting designs by lamplight. His eyes grew red from salt spray and sleeplessness. The rematch came at Naulochus. The morning of the battle dawned blood red, as if the sky itself knew what was coming. Marcus stood on his flagship's deck, the wood still smelling of fresh pitch and ambition, and watched Sextus's fleet approach like wolves circling wounded prey. The harpax weapons fired with sounds like breaking bones, their iron claws biting into Pompeian hulls with inexorable hunger. Ships that had danced away from Roman rams found themselves dragged into embraces that ended with bronze swords in their crews' bellies. The sea foam turned pink, then red, then black with blood. By sunset, Sextus Pompey's fleet was driftwood and memories. The grain would flow to Rome again, and the people would praise their triumvir for saving them from starvation. Their triumvir, not the man who designed the victory. The triumph in Rome was everything a triumph should be. Octavian rode through the streets in his purple toga, his face painted red like Jupiter himself. The crowds threw flowers and screamed his name until their throats were raw. Marcus watched from the crowd, anonymous in a simple toga, his face carefully neutral. That night in the privacy of Octavian's house on the Palatine, his friend tried to explain, they sat in the garden where years ago a bargain had been struck. Octavian spoke of political necessities, of the need for a single figure for the people to rally behind. The wine tasted of ashes as he revealed the fate of others who'd shone too brightly. Salvadinus Rufus, brilliant, ambitious, necessary. Until he wasn't. The charges of treason had been easy to manufacture, the execution easier still. The message was clear. Be indispensable but invisible, essential but erasable. Live in the shadows or don't live at all. Marcus drained his cup and considered his options. He could leave, take his talents elsewhere, or claim his rightful glory and likely find himself charged with conspiracy. Or he could accept this new reality. He thought of Lucius, still alive because of Octavian's mercy. His acceptance came without words, just a nod that Octavian understood perfectly. Marcus had discovered the secret to surviving while talented in Rome. It was a hell of a way to live, but it beat the alternative of not living at all. The weight he carried grew familiar, the way a soldier's pack becomes part of his body after enough marches. For over a decade, Marcus perfected this dance of shadows and silence. Then came the day when all those years of invisible service would culminate in the greatest performance of his life. September 2nd, 31 BCE, the day Marcus Agrippa won the Roman world for his friend, and got to watch from the sidelines as history gave the credit to another. The morning mist clung to the Ambracian Gulf like a burial shroud, and through it, two fleets faced each other with the weight of empire between them. On one side, Antony and Cleopatra, their ships heavy with Eastern gold and Egyptian dreams. On the other, the future Augustus and his architect of victory, ready to paint the waters red in the name of Roman virtue. But the battle had been won months before the first arrow flew. Marcus had spent the spring and summer doing what he did best, winning wars before they started. While Octavian made speeches about Roman values and the corruption of Eastern queens, Marcus had been busy with more practical matters. Gold changed hands in midnight meetings. Antony's officers discovered their families threatened or their debts mysteriously paid. Seeds of doubt were planted with the care of a master gardener tending poisonous blooms. The blockade had been Marcus's masterpiece. For months his ships had strangled Antony's supply lines like a patient python. No grain reached the bloated fleet. No fresh water beyond what rain provided. Disease spread through Antony's camps. Helped along by deserters Marcus had carefully infected before allowing them to escape. By the time the battle dawned, Antony's forces were already corpses that didn't yet know they were dead. Half his rowers were too weak to pull their oars properly. His soldiers, the fierce eastern legions that had conquered Parthia's borders, were hollow-eyed shadows held upright by habit more than strength. Cleopatra understood what Antony, blinded by pride and wine, could not. Marcus had seen her watching from her golden flagship, those famous eyes calculating odds with the cold precision of a mathematician. She knew this wasn't a battle. It was an execution choreographed months in advance. When her purple sails unfurled and she broke for open sea, Antony made his choice. He abandoned his fleet to chase after his Egyptian queen like a lovesick boy. His men watched their commander flee, and with him went their will to fight. What followed wasn't a battle, but a slaughter dressed in the clothes of war. Marcus gave the orders with the dispassion of a farmer harvesting wheat. No quarter, no mercy, no survivors to spread tales. The water turned red, then black, as thousands of men discovered that drowning was the lucky option. Some tried to swim for shore. Marcus had positioned small boats filled with archers for exactly this purpose. Others clung to wreckage, calling on gods both Roman and foreign. The gods remained silent while Roman swords provided the only answer that mattered. The burning ships provided the day's most horrific spectacle. Greek fire, that Syrian secret Marcus had paid dearly to acquire, turned Antony's abandoned flagships into floating crematoria. Men jumped from the flames only to find the water itself ablaze with spreading oil. By noon, it was over. Antony's grand fleet of 500 ships was reduced to floating charnel houses and slowly sinking funeral pyres. The seabirds had fallen silent, as if stunned by the magnitude of death. Octavian boarded Marcus's flagship as the sun reached its zenith, carefully stepping over the blood and viscera that made the deck treacherous. He wore his armour pristine and untouched by combat, his purple cloak somehow managing to catch the light just right. He surveyed the devastation with satisfaction, speaking of restoring order, of saving Rome from Eastern corruption. In the official version being scribbled down by secretaries, Octavian's tactical genius had won the day. Marcus's name would appear as a subordinate commander following orders. That night, as funeral pyres for the Roman dead cast dancing shadows across the camp, Octavian found Marcus standing alone on a cliff overlooking the gulf. He spoke of the future, of the peace they would build together. Marcus listened and said nothing, thinking of the thousands of Roman dead floating below. He'd delivered the world to Octavian on a platter of corpses. His reward was to continue being the knife in the darkness. Peace, as Marcus knew, was just what you called it when all your enemies were dead. The dawn came slowly. Paint in the gulf rose and gold. Beautiful colours that couldn't quite hide the bloated bodies still floating like obscene lilies on the water. In the years that followed Actium, as Rome celebrated its new peace, Marcus found another way to wage war, this time against his own conscience. They say Marcus Agrippa transformed Rome into a city of marble. What they don't mention is that every stone was a desperate attempt to wash blood from his hands. The compulsion started small. In the days after Perugia, when the smell of charred flesh still clung to his clothes no matter how many times he washed them, he'd found himself sketching on wax tablets. Not battle plans or supply lists, but fountains, clean water bubbling up from the earth, washing away everything. By the time he returned from Actium, the compulsion had become an obsession. He would wake in the pre-dawn darkness, his sheets soaked with sweat that smelled of Greek fire, and immediately reach for his architectural plans. The Aqua Julia was first, begun while memories of burning cities were still fresh. Marcus threw himself into the project with the same methodical intensity he brought to warfare. He personally surveyed every mile of the route, tasting the water at the source to ensure its purity. The Senate complained about the cost. 20 million sesterces for water, but Marcus paid from his own funds, every coin spent like a prayer for absolution. The irony wasn't lost on him. Using gold won through bloodshed to bring clean water to citizens whose sons had died earning it. The Baths of Agrippa rose in the Campus Martius, the first public thermal complex in Rome's history, not just for the elite with their private bath suites, but for everyone. The dock worker could bathe alongside the senator. The prostitute could wash herself clean in the same pools as the magistrate's wife. He spent fortunes on the heating systems alone, hypocausts that ran beneath the floors like the hidden networks of loyalty and betrayal that ran beneath Rome's polished surface. The walls he'd painted with scenes of marine life, dolphins and sea nymphs frolicking in impossible blue waters, nothing like the dark seas he'd left behind at Actium. Opening day brought crowds like nothing Rome had seen. Citizens who'd never experienced hot water that didn't have to be carried bucket by bucket stood in wonder. Children splashed in pools designed just for them, their laughter echoing off marble quarried with blood money. Marcus stood in the shadows of a colonnade watching. A mother was teaching her daughter to swim in the tepidarium. The child's delighted shrieks piercing the general murmur. For a moment, just a moment, the sound morphed in his ears to something darker, and he had to grip a column to keep from fleeing. The Pantheon came next, rising from the field of Mars like a promise or a lie. The dome was called impossible by engineers. No one had ever built such a span without interior supports. Marcus solved it with the same efficiency he'd brought to warfare. Lighter materials at the top, heavier at the base, coffers to reduce weight while maintaining strength. A perfect eye at the apex, open to the sky, letting in light and rain alike. Because wasn't that Rome? Beauty and suffering mixed in proportions no one could separate. But even as the Pantheon rose, Marcus was already planning more. Warehouses to store grain, bridges to connect the city's fractured quarters, gardens, endless gardens where citizens could walk among flowers and forget they lived in a city built on fratricidal blood. Each project spawned 3 more, stone and concrete spreading across the city like veins in marble. His slaves whispered that he never slept. When exhaustion finally claimed him, he dreamed of buildings, clean, perfect structures rising from clean, perfect foundations. Citizens loved him with fierce devotion. They called him their benefactor, their friend. The same hands that had signed execution lists now signed building contracts. The same man who had made widows now gave those widows places to live with dignity. Was it enough? Could it ever be enough? Marcus knew the answer every time he placed a cornerstone, but he built anyway, because building was the only prayer he had left. He raised temples to gods who'd already damned him. Every magnificent structure was a monument to his impossible equation. Beauty could never balance brutality, but he would die trying to make it so. But Augustus had one more chain to forge, one more bond to secure his hold on both empire and its architect. In Rome, marriage was warfare by other means. When Augustus aimed his own daughter at Marcus, a man old enough to be her father, it wasn't romance, it was the ultimate collar, dressed up as an honour. The summons came on a spring morning when the gardens were blooming with painful beauty. Marcus found Augustus in his study, surrounded by scrolls and secretaries. The princeps dismissed everyone with a gesture, and suddenly the room felt too small, too quiet, too full of unspoken calculations. Augustus approached the subject with characteristic indirection. He spoke of dynasties, of bloodlines, of securing the succession. His nephew Marcellus was dead. Fever, they said, though Marcus had his doubts. The boy had been too popular, too independent. Fevers in Rome had a way of finding such men. The proposal, when it finally came, was wrapped in silk but weighted with iron. Julia needed a husband, a steady hand, someone Augustus could trust absolutely. Julia was 18, Marcus was 42. He'd watched her grow up. This glittering creature who laughed too loudly and loved too freely for her father's careful world. The marriage would cage her as surely as it would bind him tighter to Augustus. But what choice did he have? The invisible bonds that held him had just grown stronger. The wedding was everything a Roman spectacle should be. Julia played her part perfectly, though only Marcus was close enough to feel her trembling as he took her hand, to see the moment her smile became a mask. Their wedding night was a negotiation conducted in silence. 2 intelligent people trapped by duty, trying to find some accommodation. They reached an understanding. They would perform their duties to Rome, to Augustus, to the dynasty that needed heirs. But within their home, they would allow each other what dignity they could salvage. The children came quickly as Augustus demanded. Gaius first, born into purple, swaddling and immediate adoption by his grandfather. The boy was barely cleaned of birth blood before Augustus was holding him aloft, proclaiming him Rome's future. Julia watched from her bed, still pale from delivery, as her father claimed her son with casual possessiveness. Lucius followed, then Julia the younger, Agrippina, and finally, posthumously, another Agrippa. 5 children in 9 years, each birth another hostage given to fortune. Marcus tried to be kind. He built Julia gardens where she could pretend to be free, brought her forbidden books. She would sometimes touch his hand at dinner, a gesture charged with shared understanding. They were conspirators in their own survival. One night, after too much wine, Julia whispered that at least he was kind. At least when he looked at her, she didn't see calculation, just weary sympathy. The comparison was to her father, but also to what awaited her when Marcus died. Their children grew like forcing house flowers, too quick, too bright, too clearly marked for purposes beyond happiness. Augustus took the boys, raising them as princes. Marcus watched his sons learn to recite lineages before they could properly hold a stylus, saw childhood games become training for rule. Sometimes, late at night, Julia would weep silently in their bed. Marcus would hold her, this brilliant woman reduced to breeding stock, and wonder if kindness was just another form of cruelty when it couldn't save anyone. Julia found her own escapes eventually. Affairs conducted with increasing boldness. Marcus knew but said nothing. He protected her as much as he could, ensuring discretion. It was the only kindness he had left to offer. Late in their marriage, Julia asked if he could do it all again. Would he still have saved his brother? Marcus couldn't answer. The boy who'd made that choice was as dead as the Republic. Every child he fathered was another link in Augustus's grand design, another innocent who would pay for their parents' choices. Love in Rome had become just another word for leverage. And so, when the chains of gold grew too heavy to bear in Rome, Augustus found another use for his most trusted weapon. At 48, when most Roman generals were counting their loot and buying vineyards, Marcus got sent east to clean up other people's messes. Augustus called it a diplomatic mission. Marcus knew what that meant. Make problems disappear. For 3 years he governed half the empire with total authority. The work was familiar, but the distance from Rome brought unexpected clarity. Away from Augustus's immediate presence, Marcus could see their partnership for what it truly was. Not friendship, but mutual dependency wrapped in nostalgia. Client kings learned to fear his arrival. When he appeared at their courts, problems had a way of solving themselves. Parthian borders were secured through careful relocations. Villages that harboured dissidents simply ceased to exist. Mass crucifixions were blamed on local authorities who conveniently died before they could dispute the official version. He received letters from Julia, carefully worded but heavy with subtext. The children were well. Augustus was attentive, too attentive. The boys were being shaped into tools, the girls into breeding stock. She thanked him for the years of kindness, knowing they were running out. His body was failing. The same vigour that had carried him through countless campaigns now betrayed him. Joints ached from old wounds. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, brought dreams of burning cities and drowning men. Still he worked. Borders were secured, tribute flowed, peace was maintained, the kind that came from everyone being too terrified to cause trouble. In Mytilene he fell ill. The physician spoke of marsh fever, but Marcus knew better. Some men died from swords, others from time. but he was dying from the weight of carrying an empire on his back. The summons to return came wrapped in concern but stinking of calculation. Augustus needed him in Rome. One last task. Marcus made the journey knowing he wouldn't make another. The East had been pacified, but the cost was written in empty villages and silent screams. Marcus had become what he'd always been, Augustus's necessary monster, too valuable to retire, too dangerous to keep forever. The summons home proved what that ominous phrase meant. Augustus's necessary monster had outlived his usefulness, and perhaps Marcus knew it even as he made that final journey back to Rome. Death came for Marcus Agrippa the way he'd lived, efficiently and without glory. 51 years old, body broken from carrying an empire, he fell ill in Campania. The physicians whispered about fever, about the dampness that had seeped into his bones during his final inspection of yet another aqueduct. But those who knew him understood the truth. Some men die from swords, others from time, but Agrippa died from loyalty. Augustus raced to reach him. Grief or political necessity? Did it matter anymore? They'd been bound together so long that neither could exist without the other. The emperor needed his shadow, even as that shadow faded. Marcus's final words went unrecorded. What could he say that hadn't been written in blood and marble across the empire? Perhaps he spoke of Lucius, the brother whose life had started it all. Perhaps he said nothing, letting silence serve as his final statement. The funeral was the grandest Rome had ever seen for a non-emperor. The smoke from 1,000 burning herbs drifted across the forum, mixing with the late autumn mist. Citizens wept in the streets. Genuine tears for the man who'd given them clean water and public baths, who'd built their gathering places and temples. Augustus himself carried the urn containing his friend's ashes. The emperor, now old himself, his hair more silver than gold, moved through the crowds like a man in a dream. Some saw him weeping, others claimed his face was cold as marble. Perhaps both were true, as he placed the urn in his own mausoleum, for even in death Agrippa would rest in another man's tomb. Augustus might have remembered that winter morning when two boys made a bargain in a garden. One had offered salvation, the other had offered everything. The aftermath proved what everyone suspected. Marcus Agrippa had been the glue holding Augustus's world together. Without him, the succession plans crumbled. Julia was forced to marry Tiberius, a disaster that would end in her exile. The boys, Gaius and Lucius, would die young under suspicious circumstances. The empire wobbled, then steadied, but never with the same sure hand. History would remember Augustus as the architect of empire, but those who'd watched closely knew the truth. The architect had been Marcus Agrippa, building with other men's bones, painting with other men's blood, creating beauty to cover brutality. He'd given Rome everything: his youth, his genius, his conscience, his children. In return, he'd received the privilege of being forgotten, his name a footnote to another man's glory. Some chains once forged can never be broken, not even by death. The funeral ended, but the questions it raised would echo through eternity. The autumn wind carried the last of the funeral smoke across the city they'd built together. Rome stood magnificent in marble, its aqueducts flowing, its baths steaming, its temples reaching toward gods who'd watched it all with divine indifference. In the streets, citizens went about their lives, drinking clean water, bathing in luxury, walking through gardens built on graves. They spoke of Augustus, the divine prince who'd brought them peace. Few mentioned the shadow who'd cleared the path, who'd done the killing so another could do the blessing. But here's the thing about shadows. They only exist when there's a light to cast them, and when that light finally goes out, when Augustus himself joins his friend in the great mausoleum by the Tiber, what will history remember? The emperor who found Rome brick and left it marble, Or the shadow who mixed the mortar with his own blood, bone, and boundless loyalty? Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa had been the most successful nobody in history. He'd won an empire and lost himself. He'd built a city and destroyed a republic. He'd saved his brother and damned his children. He'd been everything to one man and nothing to history. The garden where it all began still bloomed on the Palatine, its fountain babbling the same eternal secret. Two boys had made a bargain there, trading brotherhood for bondage, loyalty for chains that would drag them both into glory and damnation. One became a god, the other became forgotten. Both got exactly what they paid for. In the end, Marcus Agrippa proved that you could build an empire and lose your soul, that you could give a city everything and still owe it more. He was the shadow who built in light, the killer who created, the loyal friend who paid for that loyalty with everything he might have been. Some would call him Rome's greatest servant. Others would call him its most willing slave. Both would be right, and that's the real tragedy. In trying to be both destroyer and creator, he succeeded at being both and neither, forever caught between the blood he spilled and the beauty he built. Every fountain that bubbled clean water whispered of men who drowned in their own blood. Every marble column stood on foundations of crushed bone. Every garden bloomed from soil enriched with ash. The citizens of Rome lived in the paradise he had built, never knowing the hell he'd created to make it possible. They blessed his name as they bathed in his pools, never tasting the salt of tears in the water. They walked his roads without feeling the weight of the chains that had dragged him along them. Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, the indispensable man who made himself dispensable, the architect who built his own erasure, the friend who paid the ultimate price for friendship. As the last smoke from his funeral pyre dissipated into the Roman sky, it seemed to form, just for a moment, the shape of a question mark. What price is too high for loyalty? What cost too great for love? Marcus knew the answer, and it had killed him.